Subscribe if you haven't already, and let me know in the comments what time it is where you are and which city you're listening from. Now gently close your eyes, and let's drift into a moment in time. Not fiction, not imagination, but a quiet reflection of something that truly happened. It was Thursday, June 12th, 2025. The sun pressed gently against the cracked roads of Ahmedabad, casting long shadows across the concrete sprawl of the city. A typical afternoon, cloaked in dust and heat. At Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel International Airport, the air was thick with humidity and movement. Families hugged, pilots checked clipboards, and overhead, the slow turn of jet engines hummed like distant thunder. At Gate 4B, passengers were boarding a flight that had no intention of becoming a memory etched in silence. Air India Flight AI-171, a Boeing 787-8 Dreamliner, bound for London Heathrow. 242 people were on board, 230 passengers and 12 crew members. It was meant to be long, uneventful. Maybe movies. Maybe restless sleep. Maybe one last look out the window over the Indian coast before the clouds stole the ground from view. The aircraft, tail number VTANB, stood silently on the tarmac, white and red and gleaming under the dusty sky. A seasoned plane, not young, not old, maintained, trusted, piloted today by Captain Sumit Sabharwal, a veteran with over 8,000 hours of flight time, and First Officer Clive Kundar, precise, alert, trained for emergencies he hoped would never come. By 1:30 p.m. Indian Standard Time, the aircraft was cleared. Cargo had been loaded, passengers seated, infants tucked into arms. A few murmured prayers. Someone near the rear scrolled through messages one last time before switching off the signal. In the cockpit, the checklists were completed with a mechanical calm. Wind speeds noted, fuel levels checked, flaps adjusted, and then clearance. AI-171 cleared for takeoff, runway 23. The engines roared, not angrily, but like a steady, deep breath. The aircraft rolled forward with rising rhythm, tires gripping asphalt, pressure building beneath the wings. And then, lift. At 13:38, flight AI-171 left the Earth behind. It should have been routine, but routine doesn't always listen. Within just seconds, less than 2 minutes into the climb, something faltered. Altitude gained only barely. The aircraft struggled to rise above 600 feet. Then came the call, the kind no one ever wants to make. Mayday, 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 Air India. 171 engine failure after takeoff. The voice in the cockpit was composed, but the weight in it was unmistakable. The control tower responded. Emergency services were notified. But in the skies above Ahmedabad, time had already narrowed. The Dreamliner tilted unnaturally. Some passengers had just reclined. Some hadn't even removed their shoes. In the left aisle, someone reached to comfort a child who asked why the sky seemed closer than it should. In row 18, a woman stared through the window, confused by the angle of the rooftops. Below, in the residential district of Meghaninagar, life continued unknowingly. A hostel for medical students stood quietly amid narrow lanes. People outside didn't yet know what was about to come from above. At 13:40 IST, within just 2 minutes of takeoff, flight AI-171 plummeted into the ground. The impact shook buildings, shattered glass 2 blocks away, and sent a column of thick black smoke curling into the sky. First responders would later say it looked like a mushroom cloud rising from concrete. Witnesses spoke of a loud blast, followed by an eerie quiet. The aircraft had crashed directly into the backside of the hostel. Flames devoured walls and windows in seconds. The sound of fire, not metal, dominated the scene. There were no screams heard clearly. Only silence, then sirens, then voices shouting names, then the sound of boots on pavement running. Rescue crews arrived within minutes. Fire teams fought to contain the blaze. By then, the thick smoke had begun to bend with the wind. A row of trees, once green, smoldered in ash. The charred tail of the Dreamliner peeked out from collapsed brick, twisted metal and glass shards. Bodies were visible, some not intact, some covered with blankets, some not yet found. Initial counts were impossible to confirm. But slowly numbers began to surface. Of the 242 on board, 169 were Indian nationals, 53 were from the United Kingdom, 7 from Portugal, 1 from Canada. A full passenger manifest would later be posted. Families called hotlines, unable to get through. Social media swirled with images, some too graphic to remain visible for long. In the control tower, the last audio recording was replayed, over and over. The captain's final words, still audible, clipped, urgent, no panic. Just process. Training. As the hours passed, the questions began. What caused it? Why so soon after takeoff? Was it mechanical or something else? By nightfall, investigators had begun their work. The Directorate General of Civil Aviation, airport officials, engineers, and foreign representatives, all gathered around the scorched wreckage under portable lights. Early theories pointed to a possible bird strike. Multiple large birds, perhaps peacocks or kites, common in the area, may have been pulled into the engines. Damage to one engine alone could destabilize lift. But a full investigation would take weeks, possibly months. By morning the smoke had thinned, but the grief had not. In the United Kingdom, 53 families woke up to a headline. Some didn't even know their relatives had boarded that plane. In Lisbon, 7 families contacted consulates in confusion and disbelief. In Canada, just one home received the call that no home wants to hear. Flight AI-171, a number now frozen, in time. But the hours that followed weren't filled with drama. They were filled with stillness, with faces lit by TV screens, with neighbors speaking quietly to each other, with airports holding flights in quiet respect, with investigators carefully moving parts of landing gear with gloved hands. Every scrap of evidence was handled like it could speak. There would be no survivors. This wasn't a movie, no miraculous escape, no dramatic rescue, only gravity, metal, and time. And in its wake, a hole in a hostel wall, a sky marked with black, and names that would never again answer a call. But this isn't a story about death. Not fully. It's a memory of a moment, of the calm before a shift in wind, of passengers with plans, of children holding window seats, of a pilot who stayed with his aircraft until the final second. There was no conclusion yet, no report, no blame, only breath exhaled and silence that hung like heavy fabric over the city of Ahmedabad. The sun had barely begun to move westward when the wreckage of Flight AI-171 stopped smoking. In the still air above Meghaninagar, a quiet morning took shape. The crowd that had gathered near the crash site remained at a respectful distance, many with hands covering their mouths, others with phones recording, unsure whether they should. The flames had died, but the heat still lingered, rising from the broken fuselage like a breath from the earth. By early evening, the last fire was out. Firefighters, exhausted and blackened with soot, stood motionless beside the hoses. Every step they took had to be deliberate. The ground was scattered with twisted aluminum, melted cabin seats, oxygen masks scorched into the floor, and small, unidentifiable fragments that once made up lives. A child's shoe, a burnt passport, a hair clip resting on the concrete, untouched by fire, as if it had gently landed there after being lifted from the air. The first responders knew not to speak loudly. In events like these, silence becomes a kind of respect. The only voices were from the investigators beginning to arrive, quiet exchanges in Hindi, English, and Gujarati. A perimeter had been formed with yellow tape, but everyone already knew not to cross it. Behind the tape, a wall of onlookers stood, some crying quietly, others not sure why they had come, only that something in them needed to. Inside the circle of wreckage, the cockpit voice recorder had been recovered. It was still. The flight data recorder, its bright orange casing partially scorched, was found later beneath a collapsed section of wing. These two devices, small, dense, unassuming, would hold the story of the flight's final seconds. Not opinions. Not emotions, just numbers, tones, timestamps, and silences. At the airport, the departures terminal sat frozen. The gate that once called out AI-171 to London now showed nothing. Some of the airline staff who had boarded the plane earlier that day sat in stunned disbelief in the break room, not speaking. Others had gone to the crisis center to offer what little they could to relatives who had begun to arrive, still holding printed boarding passes in their hands, as if they could exchange them for answers. In one corner of the airport, a makeshift center had been established with chairs, water bottles, and a few counselors. Behind one blue curtain, a man sat clutching a backpack. His daughter had flown ahead alone to visit relatives in England. He had planned to follow her a week later. The counselor sitting next to him said nothing, only passed him a tissue when he finally began to cry. News reports around the world began to echo the same headline: Air India flight crashes minutes. After takeoff at 2:42 feared dead. In the UK, major outlets ran continuous coverage: BBC, Sky News, The Guardian, each with their own tone but all carrying the same facts. A Dreamliner bound for London, downed just 2 minutes after lifting off from Indian soil. Questions were already circulating in their studios. Was it mechanical? Was there foul play? Had weather played a role? But on the ground, no one was thinking about politics or speculation. They were thinking about names. A flight manifest was slowly being confirmed. Authorities matched names to passports, photos, booking records. Families were contacted in the order of registration. The process was clinical. It had to be. Emotion could not interfere with accuracy. In North London, a retired couple had been expecting their daughter and son-in-law to land that night. They'd prepared dinner, even changed the bedsheets in the guest room. When the phone rang around 3:15 p.m. UK time, the voice on the other end was flat, official, and painfully slow. By the time the call ended, the woman dropped the handset and collapsed into a chair. The food remained untouched for days. Back in Ahmedabad, night fell slowly. Investigators worked under mobile floodlights. Every fragment of the aircraft was marked, documented, and placed gently into sealed containers. The fuselage had broken into 3 main sections. The cockpit and nose had embedded themselves deep into the building's second floor. The midsection had collapsed inwards, nearly unrecognizable. The tail had sheared off and landed 40 feet away, its Air India logo still visible, oddly untouched. Teams from the Directorate General of Civil Aviation coordinated with local law enforcement. A representative from Boeing was en route. The National Transportation Safety Board in the United States had been notified. The black boxes, which had survived, would eventually be shipped overseas for detailed analysis. But that would take time. Meanwhile, the theory of a bird strike began to take shape. Ahmedabad, like many Indian cities, has a high population of large birds, especially near open food markets and residential rooftops where people scatter grain for spiritual and cultural reasons. Just beyond the airport perimeter, such rituals were common. It wasn't uncommon for peacocks, pigeons, and large kites to soar across the airspace near the flight path. Eyewitnesses described hearing an odd, fluttering sound right before the engine whine changed. One local mechanic, who had been near the airport fence, told a reporter he saw a dark blur in front of the aircraft as it climbed. Experts would later explain that a dual-engine bird ingestion, while rare, could severely compromise lift, especially during the crucial seconds after takeoff, but that was theory. The data would tell the rest. At the crash site, temporary tents were erected. A team of forensic experts began recovering remains, carefully, reverently. Some were identified quickly through ID cards and travel documents. Others would require DNA testing. Volunteers from local mosques and temples brought water, blankets, and even prayers. They stood silently near the edge of the wreckage, whispering verses under their breath, not for show, but because the weight in the air needed it. List began to circulate unofficially. Names matched with seat numbers. In row 7, a young man traveling to begin a graduate program in Manchester. In row 12, a mother and child headed to see their husband and father. In row 21, a woman in her late 60s who had always dreamed of seeing London Bridge. The hostel that the aircraft had collided with had only 3 residents inside at the time. 2 were injured but survived. 1 was killed instantly. His name, too, would join the count. By midnight, the city of Ahmedabad seemed to pause. Traffic thinned, conversations quieted, and across the world, airports glowed under artificial light. Passengers pausing to look at boards, wondering if their flight, their aircraft, what was next. But this wasn't about fear. It was about fragility. A Dreamliner, long trusted, fell from the sky in under 120 seconds. Pilots trained for emergencies made the calls they were supposed to. Ground control responded with urgency. Rescue teams arrived in minutes, and yet everything still broke. Because sometimes flight is not enough. Training is not enough. Hope is not enough. Sometimes the air just refuses to hold us, and in those moments we are left not with reasons but with remnants. A scorched boarding pass, a voicemail that never finished sending, a flight number no longer displayed. In the days that would follow, vigils would be held in multiple countries, candles lit, names read, questions raised. But none of those things would bring back what had already fallen. For now, the night carried its silence forward, and the world slept uneasily, wrapped in the distant echo of a plane that tried to reach the clouds and couldn't. The early morning of June 13th brought a pale, reluctant light over Ahmedabad. Thin clouds veiled the sun, as if the sky itself was still uncertain about shining. At the crash site in Meghaninagar, the scene was quieter now, not because there was less to do, but because the air had shifted. What began with flames and urgency had now settled into a long process of care, of cataloguing, of quiet grief. The smell of charred plastic and scorched metal still lingered in the wind. It wasn't strong anymore, just faint enough to be noticed and never forgotten. The remains of Flight AI-171 had been stabilized during the night. Tents had been set up for the forensic teams, the rescue workers, and the investigators. White vans arrived slowly, one by one, not to bring supplies, but to carry away the bodies or what was left of them. Each van was parked with deliberate space between the others. Inside, long flat stretchers waited under clean white sheets. Not rushed, not exposed, just waiting. Volunteers stood by holding clipboards, not asking questions, not offering small talk. Their job wasn't to interpret what had happened. Their job was to bear witness. By now the number of confirmed dead had risen to over 200. The remaining were presumed, based on the trajectory, the debris field, the complete absence of any radio confirmation of landing. There was no hope for survivors, not a flicker. And somehow that clarity, grim as it was, brought with it a strange kind of stillness. The first confirmed identification came from dental records. A 42-year-old British Indian woman, seated in row 3, had been travelling alone to attend her son's graduation. Her husband had stayed behind in Surat. He had last spoken to her the night before. She had joked about airplane food and said she'd try to sleep through the flight. She never made it past takeoff. In London, Heathrow Airport was preparing for a flight that would never land. Air India's local office had issued a formal statement, followed by a longer, more somber one, confirming the crash and pledging full support to the families affected. The Indian High Commission in London established an emergency contact desk. It wasn't just paperwork. It was hundreds of incoming calls, each one asking if a name was on the list. In Portugal, similar procedures were unfolding. 7 passengers on the flight had Portuguese passports, mostly elderly travellers visiting. Extended family. Lisbon's foreign ministry expressed condolences, and consular staff were dispatched to Ahmedabad. There was no ceremony in their arrival, just folded hands and bowed heads. By mid-morning, the official theory of a bird strike had gained traction. Aviation experts, in coordination with airport wildlife control, began collecting feather and tissue, samples found embedded in the engine intakes. High-resolution cameras were used to examine dents, scratches and blade marks. It wasn't enough to say a bird had hit the aircraft. The question was whether both engines had been affected, whether thrust had been lost symmetrically, or in a way that caused uncontrollable imbalance. Bird ingestion is rare, but not unheard of. What made this event different was the speed at which everything failed. The aircraft barely climbed. It didn't. Bank didn't circle, didn't even have time to return to the runway. That lack of altitude, combined with the densely populated neighborhood below, left no margin for error. In the control tower, recordings were replayed again, each second timed. At 13:38:11, the plane lifted off. By 13:39:37, the Mayday call was made. By 13:40:05, all contact was lost. The entire disaster unfolded in under 2 minutes. Outside the terminal, a wall of photographs began to form. Family members printed pictures, some from passports, others from Facebook, old wedding albums, graduation days. They taped them to a long wooden board with messages scribbled in Gujarati, Hindi, Urdu, English and Portuguese. Under each photo was a note, not always a name, sometimes just, "She was going home," or "My son, 24 years old." There was no official ceremony that day, just people gathering slowly, placing candles, touching the images, weeping quietly. Strangers held each other. No one asked which religion anyone belonged to. A temporary morgue had been set up inside a secured facility on the airport grounds. The bodies were tagged and kept under refrigeration, awaiting identification. Some were intact, others were not. In cases of severe trauma or burns, samples were taken for DNA. Families who had been asked to provide reference samples did so with trembling hands. Sometimes strands of hair, sometimes toothbrushes, sometimes just silence. In the media, the story continued to unfold. But in the sleep-inducing hum of the real world, it wasn't about headlines. It was about absence. An elderly couple in Birmingham waited by the phone, unable to eat. Their daughter had taken the flight to surprise them. She hadn't told them until the last minute. She wanted to knock on their door like a movie scene, but the knock never came. In Toronto, the family of the sole Canadian on board received the news privately. His name was not released to the public by request. He had been visiting India for a spiritual retreat, planning to return home to begin a new job in tech. His sister later posted a photo of the two of them from childhood, sitting on a swing, laughing. She wrote only 3 words, "Come home soon." Investigators kept working, even as fatigue crept in. Every wire, panel and bolt was examined. Interviews were conducted with airport ground staff, mechanics, catering crew, ATC officers. No one had seen or heard anything unusual before takeoff. Weather was calm. No strong crosswinds, no lightning, no mechanical warning lights reported. Attention slowly shifted to the airport's wildlife hazard management plan. Satellite images showed grain scattered on rooftops just a few hundred meters from the end of the runway, possibly placed for ritual purposes. Officials hesitated to comment, not wanting to draw lines of blame too early. But questions were being raised about risk mitigation and whether the known bird density had been underestimated. Meanwhile, back at the crash site, the hostel building was cordoned off completely. Structural engineers confirmed it was unsafe. Cracks in the load-bearing walls extended from foundation to roof. The students who had lived there, the few who survived, were moved to a temporary facility. One of them gave a short statement. "I just remember hearing the sky tear open, and then it all went black. There were no remains of the overhead bins, no seat cushions, no aisle. The impact had turned the aircraft into fragments, and those fragments into dust. But the humanity hadn't vanished. In the charred debris, recovery workers found a single photograph, warped and blackened, but still visible. It showed a mother and daughter smiling beside the Ganges River with London 2025 written on the back. It was carefully sealed in plastic and marked for return to the family. Even in silence, memory finds a way to breathe. By late afternoon, clouds rolled in again over Ahmedabad. Not dark clouds, just soft, thick ones that dulled the light. It felt almost appropriate. The air grew cooler, and at the crash site a small group of local residents gathered again. This time not to ask questions, just to stand. One man held a sign, "May your final journey be gentle." No one spoke. For nearly 30 minutes the group stood in a semicircle, hands folded, eyes closed, breathing in the quiet. The fire trucks had left. The police barriers had been pushed further back. But here, in this narrow corner of the city, something sacred had settled, not closure. That never comes quickly. But presence, witness, a fragile peace, and somewhere high above them, in the quiet corridors of the atmosphere, the air carried no more fire, only wind and ash, and the invisible echo of a plane that rose, faltered and fell, carrying with it names, stories, memories, all now woven into the stillness of the earth. If you're still awake, remember to subscribe, and let me know what time it is where you are and which city you're listening from. Now breathe slow, soften your shoulders, and let the stillness carry you. The afternoon leaned into the evening. As the sun began to fall behind the skeletal remains of the hostel wall in Meghaninagar, the air had cooled slightly, not because the temperature had changed much, but because the mood of the city had. Streets that usually roared with motorcycles and auto rickshaws now echoed only softly. Shops near the crash zone remained closed, some out of caution, others out of respect. At the crash site, the work hadn't stopped, but the pace had changed. There was less fire now, less noise. What remained was methodical. Hands in gloves moving charred panels, scorched luggage handles, broken pieces of tray tables. Every item found had the potential to connect to a name, to a life. Nothing was discarded quickly. The recovery teams had been rotated, allowing some workers to rest. The psychological toll was immense. Some of them were young, working their first large-scale disaster. Others were veterans of past accidents, train derailments, fires, floods. But an aircraft crash was different. It combined so many things, engineering, physics, biology, grief, into one terrible, dense space. One forensic analyst stood near the engine housing, brushing ash off a fragment of fuselage. It was about the size of a dinner plate, warped. With singed paint still faintly reading 171, he marked it, labeled it, and gently placed it into a padded box. Around him, the air carried that faint metallic scent again. Hot steel, oxidized aluminum, and the sterile tang of burnt plastic. Meanwhile, in the command center near the airport, officials gathered around a projected flight path. A map of the city displayed the aircraft's takeoff trajectory. AI-171 had lifted from runway 23, heading southwest initially, before its climb had abruptly stopped. Radar showed the plane reached approximately 625 feet above ground level, a height too low for maneuvering, too low for gliding, too low for anything but an immediate landing attempt. But that option had vanished. Investigators now believed the bird strike had occurred within the first 30 seconds of lift. Both engines, possibly at reduced thrust, had begun to surge. The autopilot was never engaged. The pilots were flying manually, following emergency procedure, but the aircraft's speed and pitch were rapidly decaying. Inside the cockpit, as captured by the recovered voice recorder, the exchange between Captain Sumit Sabharwal and First Officer Clive Kundar had been calm, urgent but calm. Sumit was heard verifying engine pressure ratios. Clive was heard reading checklist lines. Both men remained focused until the end. No shouting, no panic. Just a methodical attempt to save the unsavable. Outside of India, the world had begun to respond. In London, St. Pancras Church held an impromptu candlelight gathering. It was organized not by officials, but by ordinary people, many of them strangers who had seen the news online and simply wanted to stand in stillness. A long table held printed names of the British passengers known to be on board. Some attendees lit candles. Others simply sat, hands in laps, heads bowed. The Archbishop of Canterbury later issued a statement calling for prayer not only for the victims, but for the responders, the investigators, and the grieving families spread across continents. In Lisbon, a quiet procession wound through Praça do Comércio. 7 white flowers were carried, one for each of the Portuguese lives lost. No speeches. Just footsteps, gentle and slow. In Toronto, the Canadian government confirmed the death of one of its citizens aboard flight AI-171. No details were released, honoring the family's request. But in one Toronto suburb, neighbors placed candles. Outside the house on the front steps, a silent gesture understood without needing to be explained. Back in Ahmedabad, the city's residents had begun collecting supplies for the recovery teams. Cold water, spare gloves, masks. A group of high school students from a nearby neighborhood arrived quietly and handed out food packets. They didn't speak much, just nodded, bowed slightly, and returned to the edge of the street to wait for instructions. Inside one of the triage tents near the crash site, a small pile of personal belongings was growing, not large, just fragments. A partially burned travel pillow, a melted smartphone, a pair of sunglasses with one lens shattered, an airline boarding stub with the name, still legible, A. Patel. Everything was catalogued and preserved. In the family's center at the airport, relatives continued to arrive. Some had traveled overnight, some still wore the clothes they'd left in. The air inside the holding room was cooled but heavy. Monitors on the wall displayed updated flight lists, not for distraction, but out of routine. It was still an airport, after all. The counselors stationed inside said little unless asked. Their presence wasn't to explain anything. Their role was to listen, to guide, and in some cases simply sit beside someone who couldn't speak. A woman in her 60s sat by the window, clutching a photo of her son. He had boarded the plane alone. He was returning to London after a month. In Gujarat, visiting family. She had dropped him at the terminal, watched him wave goodbye, and now sat alone, surrounded by others, yet feeling entirely separate from them. When an airline representative approached, holding a clipboard with her name, she didn't look up. She already knew. Meanwhile, international aviation authorities were beginning to respond. The International Civil Aviation Organization, ICAO, issued a statement offering technical assistance. Boeing confirmed it was dispatching engineers and safety specialists to Ahmedabad. Air India, for its part, grounded several other 787 Dreamliners temporarily for enhanced inspections, a precaution, but one that sent a strong message: transparency, vigilance, a commitment not to allow this to happen again. But everyone knew, no matter how thorough the response, no matter how careful the explanation, this had already happened. And no apology could bring the sky back. News anchors across the globe continued to cover the story, but over time they shifted focus. The world, vast and crowded, doesn't always hold on to a single tragedy. Other headlines emerged: storms in the Pacific, elections in Europe, financial markets moving quietly. And yet, for those who knew the names on the manifest, the date June 12th would remain singular. It wasn't a news day. It was the day everything was before and nothing was after. The investigation would go on for months. The data would be analyzed by experts in multiple countries. Final reports would be written, recommendations made. Airspace protocols might change. Bird control procedures near the airport perimeter would be reviewed. But those were future steps. In the present, there was only wind and names, and the soft murmur of prayer from every corner of the earth, whispered in temples, whispered in churches, whispered by people sitting alone in their rooms, holding a photo they never thought would become a memory so soon. And as darkness returned to Meghaninagar for the second night since the crash, the lights surrounding the wreckage flickered on again. The site was now protected around the clock, not from theft but from time, from the accidental forgetting of what had occurred. Nearby, an old man in a white kurta sat on a wooden stool, watching the lights from afar. He didn't speak, just watched. Every so often he would lift a small diyas, a clay lamp, light it and place it along the footpath, one after another. By midnight he had placed 22 of them, each flame small, vulnerable, flickering, but upright. Just like the passengers had been, still patient, unaware, and suddenly gone. The third day after the crash began without fanfare. No sirens, no announcements, only the quiet rhythm of footsteps on concrete, the distant hum of engines, and the low voices of people who were no longer speaking to be heard, just to acknowledge that they were still here, still working, still sifting through what remained. By this point, the crash site had become something in between a memorial and a forensic puzzle. The outline of the aircraft was no longer clear. The wide curved frame of the Dreamliner had been reduced to irregular sections of heat-warped metal and fractured interior parts. Rescue workers moved with practiced slowness through the site, their motions no longer frantic. Time no longer mattered in the same way. Every piece was touched only once, then bagged, logged, and handed to someone in gloves. There were no more signs of life to search for. Everyone knew that now. The operation had shifted into recovery and documentation. Everything left behind by Flight AI-171, physical or invisible, had to be accounted for. Not far from the tail section, a group of engineers worked around a charred section of the lower fuselage. It was crushed, but intact enough to hold key information: cabin pressure regulators, hydraulic systems, electric connectors. None of it was likely to have caused the crash, but in aviation, nothing is left to chance. Every valve, every wire, every rivet is examined, as though it could have whispered the truth before everything fell silent. Across the tarmac, in a quieter area, families were now being allowed to approach the site perimeter in small groups. They could not enter, but they could stand close enough to see the earth where the plane had struck, the remains of the building it tore through, the lingering black marks that stretched across the ground like a shadow that refused to fade. One by one they came, a father holding a photo of his daughter, printed and laminated to protect it from the breeze, a teenage boy gripping the sleeve of his mother's salwar kameez, too numb to cry, an old woman whispering a name into the wind again and again, as if repeating it might bring the person back. There were no speeches, no clergy, no instructions, just space and time. Airport staff provided chairs. Someone brought water bottles. A nurse stood nearby in case someone collapsed. But mostly those who came just stood, staring through the fencing at the heap of broken steel and asking nothing, because there were no answers to give. Inside the nearby airport facility, the black boxes had been transferred to a secure, climate-controlled room. Engineers from Boeing and Indian aviation authorities worked together to extract the data. The cockpit voice recorder had already revealed the calm, procedural efforts of the flight crew, but the flight data recorder now showed what they had been fighting against. Both engines had registered significant pressure drops just after takeoff, almost simultaneously, one more severely than the other. The first signs of irregular combustion began within 14 seconds of leaving the ground. Thrust oscillations followed. Stall warnings were triggered. The pilots attempted to adjust angle and speed, but with low altitude and engine failure, the aircraft had neither room nor time to recover. Confirmation was growing, a dual-engine bird strike, the worst-case scenario for any takeoff. Feather remains retrieved from engine housing were undergoing genetic testing. Based on preliminary visuals and regional wildlife surveys, the birds involved were likely large, possibly vultures or black kites, both common in the area, both large enough to overwhelm a turbine blade if struck directly. Questions quickly turned toward prevention. How could such birds enter airport airspace? Why weren't they deterred? Was there radar tracking for bird movement near the runway? Were the rooftops nearby, filled with scattered grains and offerings, ever inspected? For wildlife hazards, the answers were incomplete. Airports in dense cities like Ahmedabad often operate close to residential zones. The line between urban life and airport perimeter can be as thin as a wall or a road. Wildlife control measures do exist: firecrackers, trained dogs, electronic systems, but none are perfect. In this case, the birds had come at the exact wrong moment during takeoff. Just seconds before the engines spooled to maximum, there was no fault assigned to the crew. They had followed every procedure correctly. The radio transcripts showed clarity. The control tower had responded appropriately. The failure was mechanical only in that the laws of physics had not been in their favor. Large birds, metal fans rotating at thousands of revolutions per minute, the sky too low to recover. And now 242 lives gone. In the United Kingdom, public response remained quiet but steady. A few newspapers ran editorials about aviation safety and the cost of growth in overpopulated zones. But for most people, the event settled into the deeper folds of memory. One of many tragedies in a complex world, but not one forgotten by those who were waiting at Terminal 5. Not one forgotten by the man who still refreshed the flight status that night, hoping something had changed. In Ahmedabad, tributes continued. Large mural began forming along a white boundary wall near the crash site. Local artists, mostly volunteers, began painting small portraits, not perfect likenesses but symbols. A child holding a paper airplane, a mother in traditional dress holding a suitcase, a pilot with wings made of clouds. One by one, these images appeared, not labeled with names but understood by everyone. The mural was called 171 Steps to Heaven. The artist said the number didn't represent anything exact, just the image of a staircase made of passengers, all walking upward calmly without fear. No one vandalized it. No one painted over it. Across the city, a memorial fund was established for families who had lost income earners. Counseling centers received extra staff. Schools created moments of silence. Even the airports, so busy, so procedural, now included the number AI-171 in their safety briefings and emergency training simulations. Because forgetting is what causes failure. Remembering is what builds resilience. Meanwhile, the luggage, what was left of it, began to be processed. Most of it had burned. But there were fragments. A singed roller bag with initials engraved in a metal tag. A soft fabric backpack containing a few travel snacks, some cash, and a novel, unread past chapter 3. A child's small plastic suitcase with stickers from 2 previous flights. Everything was documented. Everything would be returned if possible. If not, it would be kept respectfully until a family chose what to do. No items were discarded without full documentation. Flight AI-171 was no longer a flight. It had become a sequence, a file, a set of events that would be passed by experts and engineers for years. But underneath all of that, it remained something more intimate, a moment of interruption, a breaking of time. There were those who were planning weddings, those who were heading for funerals, those going for business, for education, for dreams, for reunions, for goodbyes, and for none of those reasons at all, just flying because they had to, and all of them vanished in under 2 minutes. By the end of that third day, a deep stillness had returned to the city, not because people had forgotten, but because grief eventually grows quieter, not smaller, just quieter. It becomes something you carry, not something you fight. And in that quiet, if you listened closely, you might still hear the faint echo of an engine, a voice on the radio, a gentle reminder that in every departure there is a risk, and in every return, a grace. But not every plane lands. Some journeys stay unfinished. Some names become more than letters on a manifest. Some flights become memory. And so, beneath the soft, darkening sky of Ahmedabad, a place where metal met earth and stories ended in silence. The lights flickered once more, and the city, weary, grieving, but still breathing, laid down to sleep. The following morning, just before sunrise, a light mist settled over the city of Ahmedabad. In the quiet streets of Meghaninagar, where the crash had torn through walls and lives, the air was still. Not still like a lull before movement, but like a breath being held. The scent of ash was weaker now, fading into the background behind the ordinary smells of a waking city. Chai from corner stalls, incense from windows, and the faint trace of gasoline from early morning scooters, but not here, not at the crash site. Here the ground still bore scars, blackened concrete, melted rebar. The skeletal frames of windows that once overlooked the neighborhood now looked only into emptiness. There was no rebuilding yet, only preservation. The area had been declared a restricted zone for continued analysis. Tents remained, organized by task: recovery, analysis, storage, decontamination, and beside them always stood people who weren't speaking, either because they didn't know what to say, or because they had said everything they could over the last 3 days. Inside one of the tents, a large whiteboard listed the updated recovery status. 42 bodies had been positively identified. Dozens more were in the process of verification. A growing list of personal items, each one bagged, tagged, and linked to a row number, was logged next to them. The writing wasn't in red, it wasn't bold. Just thin black marker on plastic board, replaced every few hours as the work continued. A line had been drawn beneath the most recent names, separating the confirmed from the awaiting. Below that line, names remained only as initials. Some bodies were burned beyond recognition. Others were fragmented. Identification would rely entirely on DNA, dental records, and passenger manifest alignment. The list wasn't just administrative, it was sacred. Each line was a life. Each update represented a phone call made, or one yet to come. Some families were still waiting, watching the board from behind the perimeter barrier, trying to spot a familiar combination of letters. Some feared seeing a name, others feared not seeing one. In the recovery tent, a small table had been cleared for found documents. Passports mostly, some warped beyond reading, others remarkably intact. One had been discovered beneath the twisted frame of a beverage cart. Its photo page was burned at the edges, but the face was still visible. A woman, maybe in her 30s, smiling, eyes steady. The official placed it gently into a sealed folder. It would be presented to her family once the identification was confirmed. Another item lay nearby, a charred wallet, opened to reveal a UK driver's license. It belonged to a man seated in row 9, travelling alone. A customs declaration form was folded neatly behind it, never filled out. Across the airport campus, the family's support centre had now become something closer to a chapel. Rows of chairs remained, some occupied, some not. Tea and water were offered without needing to ask. Staff moved silently, offering tissues, phone chargers, and updates, when they had any. There were few words now, just waiting. Eyes red from exhaustion, shoulders slumped in long hours of stillness. Occasionally someone would whisper a prayer or press their hands together and bow slightly toward the floor. The grief had changed form. It was no longer sharp and loud. It had settled into something deeper, a kind of quiet weight that clung to the skin and moved through the body like gravity. In the corner, a man in his 50s sat with a small notebook. Every now and then he would open it and look at a list of handwritten phone numbers, then close it. He had already called each one, left messages, sent texts. No one would reply now. But he kept checking, as if his daughter, who had boarded AI-171 on her way back to university, might still find a way to answer. Elsewhere in the city, government officials continued their press briefings, calm, rehearsed, factual. They confirmed that initial findings from the black box data aligned with the bird strike theory. The engine failures were consistent with rapid turbine ingestion. Engine number 1 had failed first. Engine number 2 had continued functioning at reduced thrust, but not enough to maintain climb. The crew had attempted to return to the airport, but had insufficient altitude and control authority to make the turn safely. There was no evidence of sabotage, no explosive residue, no pilot error, no maintenance lapse, only the raw, uncontrollable chaos of nature. The words brought little comfort to those waiting, but they mattered. In aviation, clarity is often the only closure there is. At the same time, international organizations began offering support. The British government announced it would assist in transporting remains for UK citizens. Portugal and Canada followed suit. Private airlines and commercial operators expressed condolences. Pilots across the globe marked the tragedy with a symbolic gesture, turning on the landing lights during takeoff, a subtle tribute in memory of the crew that never returned to cruise altitude. Back in Meghaninagar, the mural project continued. More volunteers had arrived. Artists from across Ahmedabad came together to add their strokes. A man painted a suitcase with wings. Another added a pair of shoes left untied. One woman painted a clock, frozen at 13:38, the moment of departure. Not the crash, not the end, the beginning. Because that was where their journey had ended. And for those left behind, remembering how it began mattered too. Local school children came by the next morning. Teachers guided them along the edge of the wall, explaining the events in hushed tones. The children didn't speak much. Some clutched their school bags tightly. One placed a flower beneath the mural. Another simply stood, eyes wide, looking at the painted sky. Later that day, the mural was officially declared a protected tribute by the city council. It would remain untouched, preserved, a living memory that no wind or time could erase. As the day moved forward, identification efforts intensified. DNA collection teams, flown in from Delhi and Mumbai, coordinated with local labs to expedite testing. Families provided reference samples voluntarily. Every effort was made to ensure that no remains would be misidentified or separated. Even the smallest fragments were treated as belonging to a story that deserved accuracy. In one lab, a technician paused while cataloging bone fragments, her eyes briefly closing. Not from fatigue, though that was present too, but from the emotional toll. These were not just items. These were hands that once held luggage, feet that once stood at check-in counters. Every piece was sacred. By sunset, the city had returned to a slow rhythm. Shops had reopened. Buses moved again. The city breathed, not normally, but steadily. But the sky above the airport remained quieter than usual. Fewer flights, lower frequency. And those who boarded outbound planes that evening did so with a little more reverence, a little more awareness. Many looked out the window as the aircraft lifted off, not in fear but in respect for the sky that had just days earlier refused to hold one of their own. In the cockpit of one outbound flight to Dubai, the captain spoke softly before takeoff. "We remember the souls of AI-171 today. May their journey onward be gentle. May we fly safe. May we arrive." No applause followed, no announcements, just the whine of turbines, the roll down the runway, and the steady climb into fading light. Back at the crash site, floodlights flickered on again. Night workers resumed their rotations. The work was not yet over. It might not be over for months, but it would continue, carefully, reverently, without haste. A name is not just a record, it is a final place to land. And every piece of this aircraft, every rivet, every buckle, every charred scrap of aluminum, was a page from a history that deserved to be read completely. Because memory is not just what we recall, it's what we refuse to forget. And so the city slept again. Not peacefully, not fully utter, but gently, beneath a sky that had taken so much and a ground that still held the weight of all that had been lost. The fifth day after the crash opened like a page turned slowly. The sounds of daily life in Ahmedabad returned in fragments. A child calling for their mother, the metallic clang of shutters opening, a bicycle bell, clear and sharp in the morning air. But just a few kilometers from the center of the city, at the site where flight AI-171 had broken apart, time still moved differently, as if it had not resumed, only paused more quietly. The ground was no longer hot, but the air above it still carried warmth from the fire that had once roared through steel and carbon. The tents now cast long shadows, and beneath them, workers moved steadily, less urgently than before, but still with the heaviness that comes when each motion holds consequence. Today's work focused on mapping, not just the debris field that had already been sketched, photographed, digitized, but the microfield, the pieces of memory, barely visible, that were still being discovered among the rubble. Small plastic badges, charred seatbelt buckles, sections of interior panels still bearing seat numbers, barely legible through the soot. Someone had written down each one in a thick ledger, 11A, 11B, 12C, rows that would never fill again. Near the center of the debris zone, part of the galley had been identified. The metal racks were twisted, trays crushed beneath them. A half-melted kettle was recovered. One of the investigators paused when he found a single still-folded paper napkin with the Air India logo faintly intact. It wasn't evidence, it wouldn't make the report, but he picked it up gently, placed it in a sealed pouch, and labeled it anyway. Because sometimes dignity isn't about what a thing is worth. It's about what it once meant. At the periphery, families continued to visit. They were now allowed in small groups, guided by security officers and counselors. There were no tours, no photographs, just space to stand. Some came just to be near the ground. Others brought flowers. A few knelt and touched the warm earth. With both hands, eyes closed, whispering names only they knew how to pronounce. A British family arrived just after 10 a.m. They had lost a son, 23 years old, a recent graduate. He'd been on his way back to begin work in London, where a desk still waited for him untouched, his name still pinned to the cubicle wall. His mother brought his favorite book, the same edition she had once read to him, and placed it beneath a potted plant near the perimeter. It wasn't for anyone else, just for him. She didn't speak, she didn't cry. She just stood for several minutes, then nodded quietly to the counselor beside her and walked away. Further down the line, two young men, cousins, had come to find closure for their uncle, who had been seated in row 5. They didn't have photos, just a small packet of incense sticks, which they lit and held briefly before setting them into the soil, where the smoke curled up into the open sky. A silent offering. In a nearby tent, the identification process continued. 79 bodies had now been confirmed. The rest, in parts, in pieces, were being examined slowly, carefully. Technicians rotated in 8-hour shifts to avoid mistakes made from fatigue. Every fragment was treated as whole, every body as sacred. Religious representatives from multiple faiths remained on call to assist when needed. No assumption was made about identity without clarity. The passenger manifest, a list of 242 names, now served as a quiet backbone. Not just for paperwork, but for remembrance. Each row told a story. Parents traveling together. Solo travelers, grandparents, students, a child in 14A, a newlywed couple in row 17. All of them had passed through the same gate, listened to the same safety briefing, watched the same clouds during takeoff, and then nothing. No pain described, no last words known. Just data and debris. But not everything had burned. Inside the storage tent, a small table was covered in recovered items. They were laid out for cataloguing, not display. Each item had a number, each number traced to a row. One by one, these objects told their own version of events. A wristwatch stopped at 1340, the moment of impact. A folded boarding pass with doodles on the back. A notebook, pages water-damaged but legible, full of shopping lists, reminders, a handwritten birthday message, "See you soon, can't wait to celebrate." A small silver ring, inscribed with initials, worn smooth from years of use. They were more than belongings. They were echoes. Meanwhile, city workers began preparing the temporary memorial garden. Located in a public park just 2 kilometers from the site, it wasn't meant to be grand. It was meant to be accessible, a place to sit, to remember, a gentle space carved from the city's daily movement. A circle of stones marked the center, each engraved with a number from 1 to 242, no names, just numbers, so that anyone from anywhere could stand before them and feel included. A tree had been planted in the center, not old, not tall, but growing. A plaque was placed near the entrance. For those who took flight and never returned, you are remembered, not in silence but in breath, in sky, in every step forward. There was no ribbon cutting, no camera crews. The garden opened quietly. By the afternoon, a few people had already visited. One woman brought marigolds. Another brought a cup of chai and sat beside stone number 112 for over an hour, staring at the tree, saying nothing. Elsewhere in Delhi, the civil aviation minister met with international investigators and regulatory bodies. Talks began about revising bird control protocols, especially for airports near urban centers. New radar systems were proposed. Rooftop grain scattering, a common spiritual offering, would be reviewed in consultation with community leaders. The challenge was finding balance between faith, tradition, and safety. The minister's voice was measured. This is not about blame. This is about understanding, about ensuring this never happens again, not here, not anywhere. The words were broadcast in multiple languages. They were received with quiet approval. But for those who had lost someone, even perfect understanding wouldn't bring return. Still, the effort mattered. Back in Meghaninagar, evening approached again. The sun angled lower, casting long shadows through the wreckage. The mural wall shimmered faintly in the orange light, its painted skies deepening in hue, the figures along its length beginning to glow with a soft realism. A few more candles had been added beneath the mural. A string of bells hung loosely along its top edge. When the wind stirred, they chimed, not loudly, not in song, just in acknowledgement. At 6:38 p.m., someone rang a small handheld bell, just once. It was exactly 72 hours since the crash. Those at the site stood still. Workers removed their gloves for a moment. One firefighter placed a hand over his heart. And then the moment passed. Work resumed, because grief isn't a ceremony. It's a long, slow walk forward, with pauses along the way. And so, as night came once more to the city, and the streets cooled, and lights flickered on in apartments and stalls and alleys, the memory of Flight AI-171 held firm. Not as a tragedy, alone, but as a thread, woven now into the fabric of a city that had witnessed both fire and compassion, and above it all, in the quiet sky, the stars returned. Not brighter, not louder, but present, like names once called out over airport speakers, like footsteps down a jet bridge, like the final breath before lift. The sixth morning arrived softly. No headlines now, no front-page banners. In most of the world, the crash of Flight AI-171 had already faded beneath newer stories, political unrest, market shifts, the slow march of everyday news. But in Ahmedabad, and in the hearts of 242 families scattered across continents, the story was still unfolding, slowly, hour by hour, detail by detail. At the crash site, dust had begun to settle, not just on the debris, but in the air itself. Cleanup hadn't begun. It was still far too early. The site remained an open case. Investigators continued walking the terrain with clipboards and cameras, noting the angles of scorched metal, the distribution of seat frames, the locations of burn marks. Drones hovered quietly overhead, capturing fresh images with every change in light. The soundscape here had become familiar. The soft sweep of boots on gravel, the occasional murmur of conversation, the distant clink of tools, but mostly the hush of presence, people working not just with their hands, but with intention. Every item lifted from the site passed through a chain of respect. It didn't matter if it was a tray table or a fragment of bone, it was handled with the same steady care. In the tent where personal items were catalogued, a volunteer opened a charred suitcase with gloved hands. Inside, mostly ash, but beneath the layers, he found a scorched paperback book with pages fused together, a prayer bracelet of red thread, and a note folded into eighths. The ink had run, but some words were still legible. "Don't forget to call when you land." The note was sealed in a separate envelope and marked for family return. Nearby, a small cabinet held items already processed: watches, ID cards, mobile phones, pendants, wallets, fragments of clothing, each tagged, each assigned a number that corresponded to a name on the manifest. There were 242 names on that list. By now, over 110 of them had been identified with certainty. The rest were still waiting. At the city morgue, the process continued behind closed doors. Medical staff moved like clockwork, balancing the sterility of their procedures with the human weight of their task. DNA swabs were matched. Dental records arrived by fax from embassies and consulates. Calls were made to retrieve X-rays from hospitals, universities, family doctors. There were no shortcuts. Every name deserved to be spoken again. Back at the family center, the waiting had changed. Some families had received the call. They knew the status of their loved one. They had made the difficult decision about whether to claim the remains in India or arrange for international transport. Each option carried its own weight. Bureaucracy didn't pause for grief. In the hallway of the center, a counselor stood with a middle-aged couple who had just learned that their daughter's remains had been identified through dental records. She had been seated in row 22, a university student in the UK. The couple had traveled from Surat overnight, carrying only a small backpack between them. They were quiet, composed. The father asked about the procedure for cremation. The mother just asked if someone had found her daughter's earrings. She had lent them to her for the trip. No one answered. The counsellor simply nodded and promised to check. In one of the side rooms, a whiteboard listed scheduled briefings. Next of kin could attend or they could opt out. Everything was optional now except the grief. Outside, flowers continued to arrive. A local florist began placing fresh garlands on the fence every morning. No one asked her to, she just came. Her brother had been a cargo handler at the airport and had helped load the aircraft that day. He was not on the plane, but he felt connected to it. So she brought flowers, small offerings of continuity. In Lisbon, the Portuguese government confirmed that remains of all 7 of its citizens had been identified. Repatriation arrangements had begun. A statement from the Foreign Ministry read simply, "They are coming home." No names were released. The families had requested privacy. But in a quiet square in Coimbra, a candlelight vigil drew several hundred attendees. Poems were read, names whispered. One man played a violin for 14 minutes, the estimated time it would have taken for the plane to reach cruising altitude, had it made it that far. In London, preparations were underway for a larger remembrance. St. Martin in the Fields had announced a public service for all UK nationals lost in the crash. The church had held similar services in the past, for terror attacks, fires and other air tragedies, but this would be quieter. No cameras, no speeches, just readings and music and space. Air India announced plans for a memorial plaque to be placed both in Ahmedabad and at Heathrow Terminal 4. The plaque would bear no individual names, only the flight number, the date and the words, "May their journey onward be gentle." At the headquarters of the Directorate General of Civil Aviation, the technical report was expanding. The evidence increasingly pointed toward a catastrophic dual-engine failure caused by high-mass bird ingestion. The ingestion likely occurred seconds after liftoff. Engine 1 lost thrust almost immediately. Engine 2 lost partial thrust. The flight crew had attempted to level the aircraft and return, but with the Dreamliner at such low altitude and climbing slowly, the margin for any corrective action was too narrow. Bird remains had been confirmed in both engines. DNA analysis traced them to Milvus migrans, black kites, large raptors common in urban India, especially near waste disposal areas and rooftops where food is often offered to birds. It was a convergence of misfortune. A moment of air, bird and engine overlapping in exactly the wrong way. No one had done anything wrong. But still, everything had gone wrong. That night, just before 10 p.m., the mural wall in Meganinagar was visited by a group of flight attendants, all off-duty, all in uniform. They walked slowly along the edge of the painted images, each carrying a small paper lantern. At the center of the wall, beneath the image of the plane ascending into a painted sky, they placed the lanterns on the ground and lit them one by one. They didn't speak. They didn't pose for photos. They simply stood for several minutes, then turned and walked back into the dark. A local child watching from a balcony whispered to her mother, "Are those the people from the plane?" Her mother held her close and said, "No, Beta, those are the ones who remember." And that was enough, because remembering isn't about knowing every detail. It's about carrying something forward. And so, as another day ended over the silent remains of Flight AI-171, the wind moved gently through the tents. A single piece of aluminum rattled against a steel post, a paper tag fluttered, and the earth, scarred but not surrendered, held the memory of what had fallen. The city exhaled again, and somewhere high above, in the sky where the flight once aimed to go, the stars held their places, indifferent yet eternal, still shining, still watching, still there. 7 days after the crash, the wind shifted slightly over Ahmedabad. It wasn't dramatic, not a gust, not a storm, just a gentle redirection of the air, the kind you only notice if you've been standing still long enough. And near the site of the fallen aircraft, where the sound of jet engines had been replaced by shovels, murmurs, and the soft buzz of portable generators, that change in the wind meant something. It carried with it a cooler scent, less of ash, more of dust, less of tragedy, more of time passing, but the memory had not loosened. Work at the site continued. The area had shrunk slightly. Sections of wreckage had been lifted and moved under protective tents. A steel frame had been erected to support what remained of the midsection fuselage. It no longer resembled a plane, but a shell, a husk of shape and weight. Something that had once moved people through the sky now stood as a monument of immobility. Investigators had taken everything they could. Measurements, samples, photos, structural data. The voice recorder had been fully transcribed. The flight data recorder's final report was nearly complete. A timeline had been built, second by second. It was stunning in its clarity and unbearable in its swiftness. And 38:11, rotation and liftoff from runway 23. 13:38:27, initial bird strike, left engine surges. 13:38:40, right engine fluctuations begin. 13:39:15, thrust drop noted on both engines. 13:39:37, Mayday declared. 13:40:02, final radar contact. 13:40:05, impact with residential. Building 54 seconds from the first sign of failure to the end. That's all. And in that time, the two pilots did everything they had been trained to do. Their voices never rose above procedural calm. Their decisions, logged and confirmed, matched training protocols exactly. Their final words were clipped, professional, clear. Unable to maintain climb, turning back, standby, then silence. There had been no time to tell the passengers. No PA announcement, no warning. For most on board, it had likely felt like turbulence, a slight dip, perhaps a strange sound, maybe a few startled glances, a hand gripping an armrest a little tighter, but no panic, no screams. Impact was immediate. Final dot back on the ground, the families were living in a different kind of time, a slower one. One measured not in seconds, but in waiting, in waking up each morning with a knot in the stomach, in hoping for a call that might bring clarity, and dreading that same call for what it might confirm. By now, most of the victims had been identified. The number of known names had passed 200. Repatriation efforts had begun. Coffins were prepared under diplomatic procedures. Some were flown home under the care of embassy staff. Others were laid to rest in India, according to family wishes. One funeral took place just after dawn in a small village near Vadodara. A young woman, aged 28, had been on her way to a research fellowship in Oxford. Her body was found with her backpack still strapped to her shoulders. The family chose to bury her in a grove outside the village, beneath a tree she had played under as a child. No cameras, no press, just silence, and the sound of leaves shifting above. In London, the first arrivals came through Heathrow's diplomatic terminal. No public access. The coffins, draped in white covers, were met by representatives from the consulate and quietly transferred to waiting vehicles. Families were notified in advance. Some chose to meet the remains privately. Others asked for space. One man stood outside the terminal with a folded photo in his hand. It showed his wife and their 2 sons on a beach in Goa. She had taken the boys back to visit family. She was returning alone to prepare their school term. Only her name was on the manifest. The boys had been scheduled to fly next week. He didn't speak to anyone, just watched the van pull away. Then folded the photo again and put it in his jacket pocket. In the Indian Parliament, a moment of silence was held before the morning session. The Speaker read out the total number of lives lost. No debate followed. No political point scoring. Just bowed heads and 30 quiet seconds in a room usually filled with sound. Outside the Parliament building, a group of aviation students had gathered. They held up signs, not in protest, but in tribute. "Respect the sky," one read. "Remember 171, said another. A third simply displayed a feather, drawn in ink, with no words. In Meganinaga, the mural had now expanded to its full length. Dozens of painted faces, stylized, abstract, now adorned the wall. The artists had decided not to label them, not to match each to a passenger. Instead, the images would remain open, ambiguous, a chorus of human form meant to represent everyone and no one in particular. One of the muralists, a young woman named Parvati, explained in a soft voice to a reporter, "It's not about making people look like anyone. It's about making them feel like someone." At night, the mural glowed faintly under solar-powered lights. People continued to visit. They left paper cranes, marigold garlands, letters, photographs. One child placed a model airplane on the wall's base, painted with the same Air India colors. In the family's center, grief had softened into routine. People who had once been strangers now sat together, sharing snacks, memories, even silence. Some had returned home. Others stayed in Ahmedabad, unwilling to leave until everything was resolved. But by now, most knew that resolution wouldn't look like answers. It would look like adaptation. The crash had happened. No one could change that. But how they carried the loss, that was still unfolding. A team of spiritual leaders had begun offering interfaith ceremonies, short, non-denominational, quiet, passages from multiple traditions, moments of breath. No preaching, just the reminder that in every language sorrow can be acknowledged. One morning a Buddhist monk stood before a small gathering and spoke. "There is no way around grief. There is only through. May your sorrow not be heavy but wide. May it teach you how deep love goes." No one clapped, but no one moved for a long while after. At the airport, security had increased, not because of a threat, but because the air itself had changed. Takeoffs were quieter. Passengers looked up a little more often during ascent. Pilots paused a moment longer before lifting off the runway. No one said it out loud, but everyone flew with a little more reverence. In a quiet meeting room, airport officials reviewed new policies. Wildlife control was being expanded. Rooftop surveys had begun. Local religious leaders were invited to discuss alternate offerings, ways to preserve tradition without drawing birds into flight paths. The tone was cooperative. No blame, just responsibility. On the 8th evening, something unusual happened. A violinist came to the crash site. He didn't announce himself, he didn't wear performance clothes. He just stood near the mural wall, tuned his instrument under a street lamp, and began to play. Slowly, gently. Not sad music, not dramatic. Just a series of long, floating notes that rose and fell like breath. Passers-by stopped. Some sat on the ground, some wept quietly. A few took out their phones, but most did not. When he finished, he bowed, not to applause but to the wall, then packed his case and walked away. No one asked his name, because some offerings don't need labels. Some are just meant to be heard once, then carried quietly into sleep. The city had started moving again. Markets reopened, trains resumed their honks at crossings, and school bells rang their familiar chime. But even in motion, Ahmedabad hadn't forgotten what had happened. It simply absorbed it. The crash site, the murals, the quiet vigils, they had folded into the landscape like long shadows that returned each evening without needing to be summoned. 10 days had passed since the fall of Flight AI-171, and by now the city no longer flinched at the sound of planes overhead. At the center of the recovery operation, the tents were fewer. Only one large tent remained near the impact site, its edges flapping in the heat breeze. The tent was for storage now, not of debris or equipment, but of memory. Inside were labeled crates. Some held seat fragments, oxygen masks, tray parts, burnt uniform pins, melted window frames. Others contained personal effects. Each had been cleaned gently, stabilized, and placed in padded containers. A sign on the front of the tent read, "Awaiting return." Volunteers now staffed the area. Many of them hadn't known anyone on the flight. Some weren't even from Ahmedabad. But something about the story had drawn them there. A desire to witness, a need to help restore order from wreckage, even if that order was only symbolic. Among them was an elderly man named Anwar. He didn't speak much, just arrived every day with a thermos of tea and offered it to anyone who looked tired. He had once been a mechanic at the airport, long retired. He had loaded hundreds of planes, seen thousands of passengers off. Now he swept the ground in. Small, careful arcs, as if clearing a path for those still trying to find peace. In the forensic tent, the final identifications were nearly complete. Out of 242 individuals aboard, 236 had been confirmed through physical or DNA evidence. The remaining 6 were matched by process of elimination, correlating seat numbers, travel logs, and unclaimed fragments. There was no mystery left. Just formal closure to be delivered with care. In one case, a pendant had been recovered from near the forward galley. Inside it was a faded photograph of a newborn. The clasp was intact. After verification, it was returned to the victim's husband, who wore it around his neck when he came to sign the final documents. He didn't say anything during the handover. He just held the pendant in both hands for a moment, then tucked it into his shirt and nodded. These moments were quiet, but not small, because in the aftermath of disaster, even silence carries weight. The final accident report draft was nearing completion. It would be reviewed by multiple agencies: India's DGCA, Boeing, the International Civil Aviation Organization. The evidence was clear: dual-engine failure caused by high-mass bird ingestion. The proximity of the bird strike to the runway left no time for recovery. The pilot's actions were deemed exemplary. No technical malfunctions, no pilot error, no security breaches. Just a convergence of biology and machinery. Organic matter meeting turbine blades at 10,000 revolutions per minute. The report would recommend stronger bird management, particularly in airports near high-density residential zones. Revised protocols, elevated radar systems, public education. It wouldn't undo anything, but it might prevent something next time. At the same time, Air India finalized arrangements for a permanent memorial. It would be placed in a quiet corner of the international terminal at Ahmedabad Airport. The space would include a sculpture, a stylized wing rising from the ground, broken near its tip. Around it, a ring of benches, and a plaque engraved in Hindi and English. In memory of the 242 lives aboard Flight AI-171. Their journey was brief, but their memory endures in every sky. Construction had not yet begun, but the design had been approved. Families had been consulted. No one had objected. Elsewhere, grief moved in quieter ways. A boy in Baroda folded 242 paper cranes, one for each soul aboard. He strung them across his bedroom window. When asked why, he simply said, "So they can keep flying." A girl in Ahmedabad stopped tossing bread to the birds on her rooftop. Instead, she left seeds in a bowl on the ground. She didn't explain why, she just did. At a university in the UK, an empty chair was left at convocation. No announcement, no plaque, just an absence among the seated rows that everyone noticed and no one spoke of. In a nursing home in Goa, an elderly woman placed a photo of her grandson on the altar. He had been seated in row 23. She lit a candle and whispered, "Bachpan se tujhe udne ka shauq tha." You always loved to fly. No one interrupted her, because grief does not need to be understood to be honored. At the mural wall in Meghaninagar, small additions continued. A new image appeared. Two hands reaching upward, open, not grasping, just offering. Beneath them, someone painted a short line in Gujarati. "Panko jaye che, pan yadon rahi jaye." Wings go, but memories remain. By the 12th day, the media presence had vanished. Reporters had returned to their studios. Articles had stopped running. Flight AI-171 was now archived in databases and footnotes, but not in hearts. One counselor at the family center kept a journal. In it, she wrote not about procedures, but about the faces she saw. Not names, not details, just impressions. She wrote, "A woman who didn't cry until she touched her son's boarding pass. A man who wept only when offered tea. A girl who said nothing but wrote her mother's name in chalk on the pavement every day in the same place." The journal wasn't official. It wouldn't be filed. It existed so that someone would remember the human part of the aftermath, because forms and boxes don't carry emotion. People do, and sometimes that burden is shared in quiet, invisible ways. The recovery site, now nearly empty of machinery, began to be dismantled. The tent poles came down. The last crates were moved. The fence remained for now. But the workers left. The investigators departed. Only the earth remained marked, a darker patch among lighter concrete and the building's scarred facade. The hostel, damaged beyond repair, would be demolished in weeks to come. But not today. Today the site was left alone. As the sun dipped low on the 13th day, someone lit a small oil lamp at the base of the mural wall. Then another. Then another. Soon, without coordination, a row of lamps flickered beneath the painted sky. No one spoke. They didn't have to. Because some goodbyes are said not in words, but in light. And some journeys, though ended, continue to echo. Through wind, through memory, through every silent gaze upward. Above it all, the sky stretched wide again. Soft, blue, empty. And somewhere, just beyond sight, the shape of Flight AI-171 faded gently into that sky. Not erased, not forgotten, just carried forward in breath. 14 days after the crash of Flight AI-171, the city no longer whispered when saying its name. It had become part of the language now, not just as an event, but as a shared memory. It lived in the quiet eyes of those who worked near the airport, in the pauses between conversations among airline staff, in the careful way travelers folded their boarding passes before walking to the gate. It was no longer an interruption. It was part of the rhythm. At the memorial mural in Meghaninagar, new additions had slowed. The artists were finished now. The wall stood complete, bright even beneath the monsoon haze, yet never cheerful. Not gloomy either, just still, as if it waited for people to come and look, not to understand but to feel. Some of the names of passengers were now etched into the benches nearby, small brass plaques, each one engraved with a first name, sometimes with just an initial, depending on the family's request. There were no ages, no occupations, no causes of death, only names and the flight number beneath, AI-171. By now, every person on board had been accounted for. All 242, identified, recorded and claimed, for the few who had no family left to receive. Them community groups stepped in. Ceremonies were held. Prayers were spoken. Ashes were scattered in rivers or buried with care. No one was left alone. Inside the airport, near Terminal 2, construction had begun on the official memorial. Glass panels were being installed, and a team of designers worked silently beneath scaffolding, brushing dust from tiles and smoothing the floor where the central sculpture would soon stand. But today, work paused for an hour, because just after noon a flight lifted into the sky, not an ordinary one. It was a chartered aircraft carrying the final 6 sets of remains to their families abroad. The flight had been arranged in coordination with the governments of India, the United Kingdom and Portugal. Inside the aircraft, the remains were carried in simple coffins, each draped in white cloth, secured gently, respectfully. On board were 2 Air India staff members, both volunteers. Neither knew the passengers they accompanied, but they carried handwritten notes from the families who could not travel to India themselves, messages folded in envelopes, placed atop each coffin. Some included photographs. One had a child's drawing tucked into it, a picture of a plane in the sky with stick figures waving from the windows. As the aircraft taxied toward the runway, ground staff lined up along the perimeter of the tarmac. Heads bowed, hands folded. No announcements were made, no media coverage. Just silence. The plane lifted at 12:11 p.m. For a moment it passed over the very same flight path where AI-171 had fallen. Not deliberately, it was simply how the wind moved that day and how the runways were aligned. But those on the ground noticed, heads tilted upward. No one spoke. In the distance, the plane rose higher. It did not falter. It did not hesitate. And slowly, it disappeared into the layered clouds above, leaving behind only the sound of its engines. Not a roar, not a scream, just a low, fading breath. And then the sky was still again. Back in the family's support center, the mood had changed. There were fewer people now. Most had returned home. The chairs that once held waiting relatives now sat empty, aligned neatly in rows. But a few remained, not because they were waiting for news, but because they didn't know where else to be. One man, whose brother had been among the crew, sat by the window each afternoon with a small leather-bound diary. He didn't write in it, just held it. It had been found near the cockpit, burned along the edges but mostly intact. The pages were filled with flight logs, maintenance notes, and a few scattered thoughts. Nothing profound, just things like try new tea, in break room, and send niece birthday card. The last entry ended with ready for takeoff 171. That page had no smudges, as if the ink hadn't had time to blur. Outside the airport perimeter, a small garden had begun to grow, not an official one, just a patch of land beside a drainage wall where someone had started placing potted plants and stones with initials painted on them. A few volunteers watered the plants each evening. There was no plaque, no title, but people came just the same. One afternoon, a woman arrived carrying a small wooden box. She sat on the stone edge, opened the box, and removed a folded paper airplane. She placed it in the grass and whispered, "Safe landing." Then she left. A week later, the airplane was still there, damp from the rain, but untouched, because some gestures don't need to be preserved. They just need to be seen once. In Lisbon, a private memorial was held in a small cathedral. 7 candles were lit, no names spoken aloud. A violinist played a mournful piece that rose and fell like breath. At the end of the ceremony, a choir of school children sang a lullaby in português. Dormem agora nas nuvens, onde o vento não mais os leva. They now sleep in the clouds, where the wind no longer carries them away. In Toronto, a single tree was planted in a public park with no ceremony, just a brass marker at its base for the one who did not return. In London, at St. Martin-in-the-Fields, the planned remembrance service took place. Quiet, dignified. Photos were not permitted. A single speaker read from Psalm 139, "If I take the wings of the morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea, even there your hand shall lead. Me and your right hand shall hold me." One attendee seated in the back row wept silently into a folded program. No one approached. Sometimes grief doesn't need comfort, it just needs room. Back in Ahmedabad, final adjustments were being made to the accident report. Signatures collected, appendices finalized. The report would be released to the public within weeks. Its contents were clinical, factual, precise. A timeline, a causation, a recommendation. But its tone, though official, carried traces of reverence. Every name was included, every effort acknowledged. The last paragraph read, "This accident was caused by an uncontrollable dual-engine failure resulting from bird ingestion during the critical phase of takeoff. The flight crew responded in accordance with training, protocols, and exhibited commendable professionalism under fatal constraints. All persons on board perished, no survivors." That would be the final official word. But elsewhere, words continued. Letters arrived at Air India's offices from around the world. Condolences, poems, children's drawings. One letter, handwritten on blue stationery, read, "I never knew anyone on that plane, but now I think of them when I see the sky. Thank you for carrying their memory." Inside the airline break room, a bulletin board had been converted into a tribute wall. Photos of the crew, pinned gently. Messages from co-workers, ribbons, a quote taped near the center. They flew not for glory but for journey, not for destination but for care. And so, as the 15th day arrived and passed, the city adjusted again. Roads cleared, fences came down. The crash site was officially handed back to the municipality. The hostel would be rebuilt eventually. The mural would remain, and the benches with their brass plaques would always face the sky, because some places, once touched by grief, do not close. They simply stay open, quiet doors in the world waiting for remembrance. And as the clouds moved softly overhead and the wind shifted gently once more, a quiet truth settled across the city. Not all journeys finish, but some, even when broken, still teach us how to fly. By the 16th day, life in Ahmedabad had resumed its rhythm. The traffic lights blinked in familiar cycles. The rickshaw drivers returned to calling out fares. The vegetable carts were wheeled back into their corners at the intersection near the crash zone, and in the early hours, temple bells rang across the neighborhoods like they always had. The air moved with the same heat. The same monsoon warning drifted across the radio waves, but something invisible had changed. Not just in the physical space where flight AI-171 had gone down, but in the consciousness of those who had watched it happen, or simply felt it, like a pressure wave that left behind no mark but remained in the skin. The black boxes had been decoded. The investigation was closed. The report published, and still people came to stand beside the mural. The wall no longer grew, but it breathed. Wind carried small messages to it, folded notes placed in the cracks, flower petals caught along its base, incense sticks still, smouldering beneath painted skies. Sometimes a name was whispered aloud by a passerby, not in ceremony, just as an offering. Inside the airport, the permanent memorial was now complete. It stood modestly in a quiet part of the terminal, away from the bustle of the gates. A wing-shaped sculpture tilted gently upward, carved from steel salvaged from the wreckage. A circle of light surrounded it, not too bright, but always. Nearby, a set of small touchscreens allowed visitors to scroll through the names. No photographs, no biographies, just names and seat numbers. People stopped there, some were in transit, others had come just for that. A few reached out and touched the sculpture. Others stood still, hands clasped behind their backs. The moment was never long, but it always meant something. One day a pilot stood before the wing for 20 minutes. He was in uniform, cap under one arm, travel bag by his side. He didn't read the names, he just looked at the metal, eyes unmoving. When he left, he saluted the sculpture briefly and turned without a word. Elsewhere in the terminal, a small plaque had been placed on the wall near the boarding gates. It read simply, "This terminal remembers. Every takeoff carries the memory of those who never landed." In the months that followed, protocols changed across multiple airports in India. Enhanced bird radar systems were implemented. Grain scattering. Rituals near runways were politely redirected to safer areas. Rooftop offerings were moved to ground-level courtyards. Wildlife monitoring received new funding. It didn't erase the risk entirely, but it reduced it. And every report carried the same line in the footnotes: post-AI-171 safety revision. Sometimes change is quiet, but it still moves everything. Families scattered across continents carried their grief in different ways. In London, a man opened a foundation in his wife's name. It provided scholarships for South Asian students entering the aviation field. His wife had always wanted to be a pilot, he said. She just never got the chance. In Lisbon, a mural of its own was painted in the Alfama district. It showed a field of paper planes rising into the evening sky. Beneath it, in Portuguese, a line read, "Para os que partiram cedo demais," for those who left too soon. In Mumbai, the son of one of the flight attendants shared her final voice note online. It was a simple message she had recorded just before boarding. "Plane is clean, crew is kind, and the coffee smells strong. See you soon, my loves." That voice note was played over 1.2 million times. In Ahmedabad, local schools began teaching a safety module that included not just the science of flight, but the emotional reality of aviation. Students were taught how aircraft worked, how engines failed, how emergencies were handled, but also how families coped, how memory endured, and how resilience was not something to be waited for, but chosen gently every day. One classroom built paper planes out of newspaper clippings from the week of the crash. They didn't fly very far, but each had a name written on it, one for every passenger. At a nearby hospital, nurses planted a memorial garden on a rooftop. It wasn't large, just a half circle of soil in raised beds, some flowering vines, and a small plaque that read, "They rose. They were loved. We remember." The hospital had treated several of the hostel survivors. The memory of the impact and the bodies brought in still warm had stayed with the staff. But so had the kindness they'd received. Volunteers who brought meals, therapists who offered support, people who just stood beside them without asking for anything. One nurse returned to the rooftop garden every evening before her shift. She never watered anything. She just sat for a few minutes watching the sky, always in the same seat, never speaking. She didn't need to, because some grief is sustained not by expression, but by presence. And then the anniversary came. 1 year since the crash, no banners, no speeches, just small circles formed in the places where memory had settled. At the mural in Meganinagar, families gathered in silence. Many had not seen each other since the early days. Some had become close, others had drifted, but all returned for that. One day, a priest offered a general prayer. A teacher read a poem written by one of the children who had lost their mother in the crash. The final lines read, "I do not know the wind, but I know it touches you. I do not see the clouds, but I know you move through them. I do not understand why you had to fly, but I close my eyes and I see you still." After the reading, candles were placed in a ring around the mural, each one labeled with a seat number. No names, just numbers, like a boarding map. One last flight manifest, and then as the sun began to fall behind the trees, a plane passed overhead. It wasn't deliberate, just the usual evening flight to Dubai. But everyone looked up. The plane shimmered against the light, rising steadily, clean and distant. For a long moment it was the only thing anyone saw. No one moved. No one breathed too loud. And in that shared gaze there was a sense, not of closure, not of peace, but of rhythm, of continuation, because life did not stop. It only paused, reshaped and moved forward, and Flight AI-171, though gone from radar and roster, had not disappeared. It had entered the breath of the city, into the silence of the airport corridors, into the stories told at dinner tables, into the dreams of the children who now watched planes with both wonder and weight. It had become not a tragedy alone, but a memory with wings. And some nights, if you stood near the mural wall after midnight, when the traffic had stopped and the street lamps buzzed quietly, you could hear something, not a sound exactly, but an echo. The faint hum of engines, the rise of tires leaving runway, the soft chime of a seatbelt sign, a moment suspended in air. Not a ghost, not a haunting, just a reminder that not all flights land, but all of them are remembered. 13 months had passed. The dust in Meganinagar no longer carried the scent of char or jet fuel. Trees that once trembled in the shockwave had quietly regrown their leaves. The cracks in the pavement had been filled. The crumpled building, where the Dreamliner had ended its flight, had been leveled entirely, its footprint now an empty rectangle of tilled earth surrounded by a low iron fence. But the emptiness remained noticeable. It wasn't just a space in the landscape. It was a space in time still paused. Those who passed it did not hurry. No one played music near it. Even delivery drivers slowed their scooters when riding by, as if instinctively lowering their volume. On the eastern wall facing the empty ground stood the mural, a year older now, slightly faded in places. Dust had gathered on its lower edge, yet no graffiti had marked it, no paint had chipped. Someone, no one knew who, continued to clean it gently every few weeks, brushing off fallen leaves and rain tracks like one might straighten the clothing of a statue. It was no longer a memorial in progress. It was a permanent fixture, not an artwork but a witness. The family still came, not all at once, not in large groups. But every few days someone would arrive by foot or car, stand for a while, and leave. Some left nothing. Others brought garlands or candles, folded poems, old airline tags with names written in thick marker. One woman left a single glove and a note that read, "You took the other one with you." She didn't sign it. At the Ahmedabad airport, the official memorial site had become a quiet stop for travelers in transit. Located in a small alcove away from the check-in counters, it welcomed those with time to wait or thoughts to settle. Some travelers found it by accident, following the wing-shaped sculpture's reflection on the floor. Others asked directions. Each name on the memorial appeared digitally, fading in and out, looping in sequence. A new addition had been made, faux soft chime that played once every 90 seconds, the interval between takeoff clearances on most days. People rarely stayed long, but they looked, and that looking mattered. For the families who had returned to life, the grief had not left. But it had changed shape. It became less of an interruption, more of a companion. It accompanied grocery lists and school pickups, quiet, mornings and long silences in traffic. It was no longer a scream. It was a presence. One father, whose daughter had been in row 18, now volunteered at the airport's counseling office. He didn't talk about his loss unless asked. Most of the time he just listened. His voice was calm, his eyes steady. On his desk sat a photo turned face down. He never flipped it. It didn't need to be seen, it needed only to be near. The airline had established an internal remembrance fund, not large but ongoing. It covered counseling, travel for annual, memorial events, and supported safety initiatives. Some crew members donated to it each month, quietly, anonymously. One of them, a flight attendant who had trained alongside the crew of AI-171, kept a slip of paper in her passport wallet. It was a training quiz from their final session together. A shared joke scribbled in the corner. "Coffee service makes better landings than I do." It was unsigned, but she knew the handwriting. She looked at it every time before stepping onto a flight. The changes in aviation policy had begun to spread beyond India. Airports across the global south reviewed their bird strike mitigation procedures. New urban planning regulations prohibited rooftop offerings within designated flight corridors. Local leaders worked with temple and mosque committees to shift long-held practices towards safer spaces, not as an erasure of tradition, but as an evolution born from necessity. In some places, resistance came. Why should we change what we've always done? Some asked, but then someone would say quietly, "Because of 171." And that was enough. Not a command, just a memory that carried its own authority. Back in Portugal, a school was renamed. It had once been known as the Maritime Primary School. It was now called Escola Memorial 171. No students questioned it. The older ones remembered the news. The younger ones asked and were told gently. A wall near the library held a painting of wings, not detailed, not photorealistic, just a suggestion. Beneath it, the names of the 7 Portuguese passengers. In Canada, the lone passenger's name was etched into the edge of a hiking trail near his home. A wooden bench was placed nearby. It read, "You are still part of the path." In the UK, the scholarship fund had expanded. It now supported 2 students each year, one in aviation safety, the other in grief counseling. The founder said, "We lost flight. We should strengthen care." In India, new generations grew up not remembering the crash directly, but knowing it as part of the modern history of flight. In textbooks it appeared not in long chapters but in margins. AI-171, bird strike event, 242 fatalities. Just that, but every teacher who spoke the number did so slowly, not out of fear, but out of respect. Back in Meghaninagar, the garden beside the mural wall had become a gathering place, not for ceremonies, those were rare now, but for resting. For reflection. The air was cooler there somehow. A small fountain had been installed. A circle of white stones outlined a central tree. That tree had grown taller in the past year. Its branches now stretched over the edge of the mural, casting dappled shadows on the painted figures. Birds rested there, smaller ones now, sparrows mostly. The larger birds stayed away, perhaps redirected by the changes in the city, perhaps by fate. One afternoon, a group of schoolchildren sat beneath the tree on a field trip. Their teacher handed each of them a blank card and asked them to write something to the people on the plane. They didn't know the names, but they wrote anyway. One card read, "I don't know you, but I hope you flew fast." Another, "I will study hard because someone didn't get to." And one in shaky handwriting, "If you're in the sky, we're waving." The cards were collected and tucked into a sealed box placed beside the tree. The box had no lock, no sign, but it remained unopened, not because it was protected, but because it was honored. Sometimes memory needs no defense, only space, Aziz. Evening fell that day. The wind rose again. It moved through the leaves, across the mural, past the fences, and into the streets beyond. It carried no sound, but if one stood still long enough they might hear something in it. Not a voice, not words, just a breath. The same breath held in the final seconds of a flight. The same breath released by those waiting at the gate. The same breath shared between strangers who became a family through tragedy. Flight AI-171 never completed its journey, but it never truly ended either. It lives now in memorials and margins, in quiet rituals and everyday choices, in the softened edges of grief made bearable only by time and witness. It lives in the mural that still stands, in the wing that still points upward, in the sky that still opens wide, and in the breath of those who remember. 2 years later, the crash no longer made headlines. But that didn't mean it had vanished. Some things leave a wound too deep for the world to keep staring at, so instead they grow inward, and AI-171 had done exactly that. It lived now in the quiet rituals of people who had never even known the names of those on board. A taxi driver who always switched off his music for 5 minutes as he passed the mural. A ground crew worker who laid his palm against the terminal memorial every time he walked by, without fail. An old man who arrived at the garden each Sunday, not to grieve, but to water the plants others forgot. No one reminded them. No signs required it. Some events pass through a city like weather, loud, brief, then gone. Others settle like foundation stones. This one had done both. At the crash site, now surrounded by low fencing and shrubs, the earth remained untouched. Though cleared, it had never been built upon. A small plaque near the garden read, "This place will not be filled. It is already full." The hostel students who had once lived in the building that was struck had long since relocated. Most had graduated, some had moved abroad, but each year, on the crash anniversary, a few of them returned. They never stayed long. Sometimes they didn't even enter the garden, just stood across the street, silent. It wasn't about remembering what they saw. It was about remembering who didn't leave with them. Across India, Pilots and cabin crew still spoke of AI-171 in hushed tones. New recruits were told its story not to scare them, but to honor those who had done everything right and still hadn't come home. If anything ever goes wrong, a senior captain told his trainees, fly like Sumit and Clive. Calm, clear. No fear, just care. The black box audio, which was never publicly released in full, had made its way through official channels. It became part of simulator drills, how to fly under failure, but always with context, always with reverence. Every line from the transcript was followed by a reminder. These were the voices of real people, speaking calmly in their last moments. At one flight school in Bangalore, a plaque was mounted in the hallway. To the pilots who tried, to the crew who cared, to the passengers who flew. In Lisbon, a cafe near the Tagus River installed a stained glass panel of a Dreamliner wing, blues and silvers arranged like a soft arc against the light. Above it, the words, Memoria Voa, memory flies. It had been placed there by the sister of one of the passengers. She had no children of her own, but she brought local students to the cafe each spring to write essays on journeys that never ended. Not fantasy, not fiction, just remembrance. She never spoke of her brother. She only smiled when someone mentioned the mural in India. It means they're still arriving, she once said. In London, an archivist at Heathrow created a digital exhibition. It displayed every airline tragedy that had ever touched the airport. Flight 103, Flight 548, and now AI-171. Each entry contained flight paths, safety updates, and voices from those affected. The section on AI-171 included a map of Ahmedabad, a timeline, and a photo of the memorial wing with a caption written by a schoolchild. If they fell, we must lift. In Toronto, a bench had been added near the edge of Lake Ontario. It faced the water. No names were listed. Just an inscription carved into wood. One seat was always for you. At the airport in Ahmedabad, the terminal plaque had been updated. It now included an audio element, a short 12-second chime triggered every hour. Not loud, just soft. Bells tuned to a gentle F major. They rang through the terminal unnoticed by most travelers, but those who did hear them sometimes paused, even if they didn't know why. In a nearby corridor, a line of poetry appeared on the wall in both Hindi and English. The sky took them gently. The earth remembers them quietly. And yet, even with time, grief had not been erased. It had merely woven itself into the background, like an old thread running through a tapestry, visible only when viewed under certain light. For the families, the absence never lessened. It simply became part of the air. A mother still kept her son's boarding pass in a sealed envelope. A widower still said, "Good morning" aloud to an empty pillow each day. A child who had lost her grandfather on the flight still drew pictures of planes always with extra wings. One woman, who had lost her twin sister, wrote her letters each month. She never mailed them. She placed them in a tin box beneath her bed. Her most recent letter read, "I still save a seat for you in the car. I still order for two at our favorite restaurant. I still dream that I'm waiting at the airport and you're waving from the arrivals gate. Sometimes I don't wake up right away. I like it there." The mural wall in Meghaninagar had been sealed in clear protective resin. The colors remained vibrant. A QR code was added to a plaque nearby, linking to the digital passenger list, the accident report, and the fund that helped support aviation families in times of loss. Tourists began visiting, not in crowds, but as quiet pilgrims. Most didn't know the full story, but they understood enough. They took off their hats, they lowered their cameras, and they stood in the presence of something that had once soared and then fallen, and yet somehow still lifted others. The garden beside the mural bloomed earlier than expected that spring. The flowers weren't planted by a gardener. They came from seeds dropped by passing birds carried on the wind. Lavender, marigold, hibiscus, all blooming wild. No order, no symmetry. A child visiting the site pointed at them and asked her mother, "Are those from the people on the plain?" Her mother thought for a moment, then said, "Yes, I think they are." And they stood a little longer. That evening, a young woman visited the garden with a violin. She had come from Mumbai alone, with no family on the flight. She set a small chair beside the wall, tuned her strings, and played a slow, meandering melody. Not sad, not grand, just steady. A few others gathered to listen. No words were exchanged. No clapping followed. When she finished, she nodded once to the sculpture, packed her case, and walked into the night. The sun had long set. But even in the darkness, something remained visible. The soft outline of wings painted against a wall, lit faintly by the street lamps, watched over by a city that would never forget. Because Flight AI-171 did not vanish. It scattered into stories, into art, into policy, into ritual, into gardens and benches and music and breath. And in all those places it still moves gently through the world, a flight no longer measured in distance but in memory. 3 years. That's how long it had been since Flight AI-171 took off and never came home. No more news coverage, no more official ceremonies, no more updates to the reports or revisions to the facts. What had happened was known, fully, quietly, completely. But even so, Flight AI-171 continued, not in air, not in sky, but in quiet pulses through the ordinary world. In Meghaninagar, the mural stood unchanged. The painted sky behind it faded a little more each summer, and the edges had softened from rain and dust, but its meaning hadn't dulled. The eyes in the painted faces still watched. The painted hands still reached upward. The painted wings still curved against a dreamlike sky. Visitors still came, less frequently, yes, and more slowly. Some walked through the garden with their children. Some simply sat on the benches and looked. Others never made it past the gate. They just stood outside the fence for a while and left without entering. That was okay. It had always been okay. Inside the fenced space, the ground where the wreckage had burned was covered now in low ground cover. Not lush grass, not a garden, but a quiet green carpet, scattered with stones and the occasional marigold bloom. Nature had claimed it, but not in defiance. It had reclaimed it gently, without asking for permission. The memorial garden had grown more wild than planned. Ivy crawled up the perimeter wall. The tree in the center, the one planted after the wreckage was cleared, now arched upward above. The mural itself. Its shade reached all the way across the sidewalk some afternoons. Children sometimes traced the leaf shadows on the cement with their fingers. Nobody minded. Grief, too, has its seasons. The mural wall had become part of the city now. Buses passed without slowing, but the drivers still glanced at it from time to time. Young people sat nearby in the evenings, not because of what had happened, but because it was quiet, because it felt safe. Flight AI-171 was no longer a point of pain. It had become a presence. In the airport, the sculpture stood silent in its corner, softly lit. The brass names no longer cycled on digital screens. They had been etched permanently into a steel ring that surrounded the base of the wing-shaped statue. Passengers stopped and read them sometimes. Not always, but always enough. One woman sat there every March. She didn't work at the airport. She didn't explain herself. But each year she came in the morning, sat on the bench facing the sculpture, and left before noon. A staff member once asked if she needed anything. She only said, "No, I just visit." And that was the end of it. In Portugal, one of the families had moved. Their home in Coimbra had grown too quiet. But before leaving, they left a stone on the windowsill of the old apartment. On the underside, in black marker, Flight 171, still flying. In London, a musician had composed a piano piece titled Final Climb. It was 5 minutes and 42 seconds long, the precise duration between AI-171's takeoff and its last radar contact. The piece never crescendoed. It stayed soft, building only slightly before ending mid-note. Audiences were often silent afterward, not because they understood it, but because they felt it. In Ahmedabad, schools began including a single page about the crash in their social studies curriculum. It wasn't a story of fear. It was a story of systems, of the importance of safety, awareness, design, and training, and, in a small section at the end, the value of collective mourning. One student, aged 12, was asked to summarize what happened. He wrote, "People tried very hard and still something happened, so we made something soft for them to rest in." In that same school, an old flight attendant who had retired after the crash came to speak. She didn't share dramatic stories. She simply said, "Planes don't just carry luggage, they carry plans, hopes, people who are on their way somewhere. And when a plane doesn't land, those plans don't just disappear. They scatter into us." The classroom was quiet. A boy raised his hand and asked, "Where do they go?" She smiled and pointed to her chest. "Here, we carry them." The garden next to the mural had grown a bit wild again. A few volunteers had begun a rotation, pruning the ivy, sweeping the walkways, cleaning the small plaque at the gate. But even when they forgot or were too busy, the space still held its silence well. One evening, just before sunset, a group of students from a local college arrived with lanterns. It wasn't a planned event. They didn't announce it on social media. They brought no signs. Each student carried a paper lantern, and each lantern bore a number, from 1 to 242. They lit them slowly, one by one. Each student stood still. Then together they released them into the fading light. Not one word was spoken. The lanterns floated upward, trembling slightly, drifting toward the mural before catching the breeze and rising beyond the rooftops. An old man watching from across the street took off his hat. He had no one on that flight, but his voice cracked when he whispered, "This is how you land something that never landed." By the 4th year, a soft rust had begun to show on the edge of the memorial sculpture inside the airport. It was cleaned, sealed, but not erased. The patina was left intact, because not all marks need removing. In the aviation academies across India, the story of AI-171 was still told to new cadets, not to frighten them, but to show them what professionalism meant under pressure, what composure looked like when the odds failed, what it meant to carry hundreds of lives without ever losing focus. They weren't told to idolize the crew, only to honor them. One instructor, who had once flown with the late Captain Sabarwal, kept a photo of the man in his logbook. He showed it only once, to a cadet who struggled with self-doubt. "He never raised his voice," the instructor said. "Not even in those final seconds, not even when the engines failed. Be like that." Across the city, life had continued. New families had moved into neighborhoods once filled with those grieving. New airports had been constructed. New planes had lifted from new runways. And yet every march someone somewhere still paused, still looked up, still remembered, because not every flight ends at the gate. Some take longer, some fly on in the silence between words. In the flicker of a candle, in the gentle hush before takeoff, in the breath held during landing. And flight AI-171. It flies now only in memory. But what a powerful, gentle place that is to be. A flight no longer charted in altitude or knots, but in kindness, in reverence, in the hearts of those who refuse to let it vanish, a number etched not just into plaques and records, but into the world itself, carried on endlessly by those who still look skyward and whisper, "Safe journey."